The School Financing Review Commission meeting will begin in 1 minute. 1 minute. Good afternoon. The August 4th School Financing Review Commission meeting will come to order. Again, good afternoon and welcome to the August 4th, 2026 School Financing Review Commission meeting. Would the recording secretary please call the roll?
Jason Dolliver. Present. Keith Runge. Present. Liz Standish.
Present.
Paul Turman. Present. Sarah Scott.
Present.
Shavonna Holman.
Present.
John Schwartz.
Present.
Ann Foster.
Present.
Luann Linehan. Shauna Koger.
Present.
Aaron Plas.
Present.
Brian Maher.
Present.
Tom Breezy.
Present.
Grant Latimer.
Present.
Senator Elliott Bostar. Senator Jana Hughes.
Present.
Senator Dave Merman. Present. 14 voting members present, 2 non-voting members present.
I pledge allegiance. Well, to the members of the commission that I haven't had a chance to say hello to yet, hello, welcome. Information regarding the Open Meetings Act is posted as you enter the room from the main entrance doors. The minutes, we're on agenda item 3 if you're following along. The minutes of the previous meeting were provided in advance of this meeting. A copy is also provided for each commission member. Are there any corrections to the minutes? Is there a motion for agenda item 3?
So moved. Second.
It has been moved and seconded by Holman and Linehan to approve the minutes of the previous School Financing Review Commission meeting. Is there, there's no discussion. Would the recording secretary please call the roll?
Keith Runge.
Yes.
Shavonna Holman.
Yes.
Aaron Plas.
Yes.
Luann Linehan.
Yes.
John Schwartz.
Yes.
Paul Turman.
Yes.
Jason Dolliver.
Yes.
Tom Breezy.
Yes.
Shauna Koger.
Yes.
Liz Standish.
Yes.
Ann Foster.
Yes.
Sarah Scott.
Yes.
Grant Latimer.
Yes.
Brian Maher.
Yes.
14 yes.
The affirmative has it, and the motion to approve the minutes of the previous School Financing Review Commission meeting is adopted. Agenda item 4. Well, it seems like we just started meeting. I was informed by a member of the media earlier that this is basically 1 year. This is our 1-year anniversary. I think it was August 12th last year that was our first meeting, and here we are on August 4th of 2026, beginning our second year together. Given that as context, pursuant to Nebraska Revised Statute 7910-147.01, the commission shall elect a vice chairperson from among its members. We will now conduct the election for vice chairperson. I appoint Ryan Ford to serve as the teller. The teller's role is to disseminate and count the ballots. The teller will record each round of voting on the teller report and will announce the results of each round of voting. Upon hearing the teller report, I will declare the result of the election. The ballots and teller reports will be placed in the custody of the chairperson and will be kept under seal until the time period of a recount expires, at which time the ballots and teller reports will be destroyed. A majority vote of members present and voting is required for an election. Abstentions and blank ballots do not count as votes cast. Illegible ballots, ballots with multiple names, or ballots for anyone other than a current commission member are not credited to any candidate. When voting, please write the first and last name of the member on the ballot. In a moment, I will call for nominations for the office of vice chairperson. No seconds are required for nominations. A member may nominate himself or herself. No member may nominate more persons than there are places to fill. In this case, there is one place to fill. Votes may be cast for any current commission member, even if they are not nominated. Once nominations are closed, no further discussion or debate is in order. Does any commission member have questions about the election process? Nominations are now in order for the office of the vice chairperson.
I nominate John Schwartz to continue in the role of vice chair. I was thinking about this a little bit on the way here, and I was also trying to figure out how long this commission's been together. And I was thinking it was just about a year, which is actually pretty incredible, because I feel like we've done a lot of work in the last 12 months, like years worth of work in a 1 year period. And so I think some stability in that role would be okay too.
Okay. Are there any further nominations for the office of vice chairperson? Seeing none, I'll ask one more time. Are there any further nominations for vice chairperson? I do not see any further nominations, so nominations are closed. I asked our parliamentarian, Dr. Four, earlier, hey, what happens if we only have one person nominated for the vice chairperson? Can we vote them in via acclamation? Can we suspend our own rules? And the parliamentarian said to me, no, we still have to vote. So we are going to pass out ballots, and you will need to vote. And remember, you can vote for any member of the commission, and remember, one person from the commission has been nominated. So the ballots for vice chairperson are placed at each of your seats. Write the first and last name of the person you are voting for on the ballot. Hand your completed ballot to the teller. Have all voted who wish to do so? If no one else wishes to vote, voting is closed.
Mr. Chair, there were 14 votes cast, 14 votes for John Schwartz.
John Schwartz is elected vice chairperson. Congratulations, John. Ann Foster will, I don't know why that made me more nervous than it should have, just because I see some funny votes in this room from time to time. Ann Foster will report on behalf of the Needs and Resources Committee. After the report, there will be a review of the committee's findings and time for discussion. Maybe, Ann, before I turn it over to you, I'll just give a little context for those in the audience. There has been a good amount of committee conversation since our last meeting. I'm excited as to what all of us will be able to see today from the work of the individual committees involved. Much of what you're going to see, half of the commission will be seeing it for the first time, just as most, probably all of you, will be seeing it for the first time as well. So to all members of the commission, thanks for all of the work you've put in since last we met, and I'm excited to see what we have in store today. With that, Ann?
I'd like to invite up Dr. Plaus and Bryce Wilson with me to co-present. That's okay with you?
That's absolutely okay. They will be plugging in to our technology, so it'll take just a minute here.
We can't use USB.
All right, perfect. That was significantly smoother than if I would have tried to do it, so thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to present on behalf of Committee A for the School Finance Review Commission. Again, my name is Aaron Plaus, Superintendent, Bennington Public Schools. Just wanted to begin with just a reminder who is on Committee A. We have Ann Foster, Dr. Shavana Holman, Senator Jana Hughes, former Senator Luann Linehan, Senator Dave Merman, myself, Sarah Scott, and Dr. Liz Standish. So a lot of work has been done by the committee. And just to show our work, we have had 7 meetings between the previous time that we met and this time, each one spanning 2 to 3 hours. And so there was a lot of work that was being put in, and that was just by us. The amount of time and effort that Bryce Wilson and Tyler Kelly put together, getting us the information, because you can imagine over the course of 3 hours with 10 of us peppering them with questions, and they would come back 2 weeks later and they'd have all the answers for us. So they just did incredible work, and can't thank them enough for all their efforts. A reminder of the goals of this committee. We are going to evaluate the needs aspect of the current formula, including factors such as poverty, English learners, early childhood, college going, workforce literacy, and graduation rates. And then we're also going to look at the resources side of the formula and any potential formula changes, including how the state and local resources interact with the formula. And so that's kind of the charge. We went over this last time, but we do have some committee priorities. We always try to come back to these throughout the course of our meetings, and the first one is to simplify the formula. We often hear and we agree that the formula can be too darn complex for people, and so we always try to, as we're having our conversation, how do we simplify it? How do we make it so more people can understand how the formula works? We also want to improve our data accuracy, just because there are so many components going into the formula currently. We want to make sure that we simplified it down to be a little bit more accurate. And maybe one of the most important parts, we want to make sure all the funding aligns with student needs. We understand that not every student is created equally, and so trying to align the funding with the need was really important for us. And then the last one, you're going to hear a little bit about this throughout, but we wanted to model within a best case scenario. We really wanted to try to create a formula that we felt like was good and appropriate and aligned all the funding to the student needs, but we also understand that there are external factors that come into funding as well. And so we built it based on an ideal funding situation, but at a minimum, now we know where the levers are if things change. And so we did want to make sure that we also evaluated everything with cost and tried not to have the cost far exceed what was available. So first things first, just kind of a reminder of what the TIOSA chart looks like. I really want to pay attention to the top half. That is the needs side. If you remember a few months ago when we met, we spent almost all of our time on the second green box on the left, which was the poverty allowance. That is one of the most complicated portions of the formula. It's also an area of need that we felt like was really important to get funding into the right students and the right school systems. And so we spent a ton of time on the poverty allowance. Most everything that we're going to do today is on the top half. It's all on the needs side. We made significant progress compared to the last time that we met, but we have a recommendation on those. Something I want to point out, the peach box, I'm going to call it, where it says basic funding in the top left, that is, I'm going to make a number up, about 90% of all the needs within the state of Nebraska. And so it is by far the biggest box, the biggest portion to it. The green boxes are allowances, and what each of those allowances do is they account for the nuances within our school districts. Not every school district has the same number of students that are in special education with those needs. Not every school has the same number of students in poverty. Not every school has the same number of English language learners and transportation needs, all of those. And so what happens with the green boxes is those get pulled out of basic funding to recognize the need of the individual school districts, and then basic funding calculates based with all of those outside of it. And so we began in the green boxes because we wanted to recognize the different needs of our school districts, and then we finished with the basic funding. So it's kind of awkward to say that we started with the 10% and then ended on the 90%, but we felt like that was the right way to go about it. So we're going to talk about most all of the allowances first, and then come back to basic funding, which is the biggest portion at the end. All right, then just a quick reminder of where we left you on April 30th. The only thing that we came with a recommendation out of the April 30th meeting was that the needs stabilization would not be changed. Needs stabilization is the final product of the needs side of the formula, which essentially says that if your needs dropped, it allowed you to add back in to make your needs stable. And we had questions about that in the beginning, but as we did an analysis, it rarely is used, and when it is used, it's not for very long. And the number of schools that are receiving state aid because of needs stabilization was really small to zero. And so we felt like the function was still appropriate based on whatever potential changes were there, but we did not have any recommendations to the needs stabilization. In addition, as we looked through the poverty allowance, things that we noted was direct certification was more accurate, but we needed to find solutions for those schools that had free lunch students that were not in direct certification. So to qualify for direct certification, you're on CHIP, SNAP, Medicaid, any of those federal programs, so you're automatically enrolled in the free lunch program. You also have students that would fill out the free lunch application, and we were finding a little bit of a gap between the direct certification and the total number of free lunch students. And so that was something that we were reviewing. We were evaluating the different tiered structure to see how the funding would flow into schools that had low and high concentrations of poverty. And we were trying to find a balance between the current funding and actual needs. And then one thing we talked about doing was eliminating the district provided maximum. At this moment, you can either qualify within the formula, or you can provide your own poverty amount. And we wanted to look at eliminating the district provided maximum, and then if we went to direct certification, the 3-year average. So that's kind of where we left the last meeting. Moving forward, again, we didn't have a lot of recommendations, just a lot of information on what we had been working through. And so to boil it all down, we ended on these final two options, option 8A and option 8B. Each one of them, kind of a reminder, the top portion of it where it says tiers, that would be the number of students that you have in poverty, within the percentage of students that you have in poverty in your school. And so think of the federal income tax bracket, kind of the same concept. If you have 100 students that are in poverty, or 100% of your school would be in poverty, the 0 to 15%, for the first 15% of students, you would receive 20% of the general fund operating expenditure, the state general fund operating expenditure. And so that was the $2,958 per student. The 16th student would fall into tier 2, which would go up to 25, and that would be at 30%. And then tier 3 would be 40%, and tier 4 would be 50%. So you can see the amount of funding per student that is in would be in poverty increases as it goes up. And so we landed on these two options. Each of them, we had 9 options that we looked at ahead of time, and so we were really getting pretty deep into the weeds. Both options represented about an $8.2 million difference in total aid, but we did see 10 schools that had a significant drop in aid between the models, mostly for what we talked about before, the number of students that were in direct certification compared to the total that had filled out free and reduced and approved free and reduced applications. There was a gap there. And so we got here and we realized, okay, some of the schools that we were talking about have some of the most needs, or maybe are the most diverse within our state, and they were seeing reductions in funding. And so we paused right here and said, let's see how the rest of the model shakes out before we come back and make a final decision on poverty. And so we ended on these 2 options, but then we wanted to move forward and look at the rest of the allowances, and then we'll circle back to poverty.
So as we go through the rest of the allowances, the boxes in green that Aaron referenced before, we have asked Bryce Wilson to come in and speak and explain how those are calculated, and then I will share our recommendation.
All right, so the LEP allowance, the limited English proficiency allowance, is a recognition of additional costs for those students. The current formula takes 25% of the state average general fund operating expenditure per formula student, times the number of LEP students in a district that qualify. If a district has less than 12 students, they're going to get a minimum of 12 students for the LEP allowance. If they have the current year count of LEP students is more than their 3-year average, they get a bump for that difference. So if you have an average of 12 for the last 3 years and you have 15 students this year, that 15 minus 12 is going to be a 3-student bump to your 15 count for that current year. So also a district similar to the poverty allowance has to submit a dollar amount that they plan to spend for the LEP allowance. And when we calculate it at NDE here, the district gets the lesser of the amount they submit or what is calculated between the two. So that's the current LEP allowance. Oh, yeah. All right, so to go along with the LEP allowance, we also have what is called an LEP correction, that if a district does not spend, so one of the requirements for both, again, poverty and LEP allowances currently is that whatever amount a district receives in the limited English proficiency allowance, they have to spend 117.65% of that dollar amount received in the allowance. When the annual financial report comes in 2 years later, we check and verify that the school district spent that amount. If they don't, the difference between what they spent and the 117.65% dollar amount is recaptured in the LEP correction 2 years later in the TIOSA formula. To go along with that, if a district doesn't hit at least 50% of their allowance amount from 2 years prior, they're disqualified from receiving the current year's LEP adjustment. So that's the non-qualified LEP adjustment up there as well. So 2 additional factors that play into the LEP allowance.
Thank you, Bryce. So what did we do? We looked at what other states are doing. As Bryce mentioned, we have a single flat rate, as do 20 other states. So if you look at the top row, 21 states have that single flat rate. But we are also curious as Aaron had talked about the two-tier model. We were interested to see what would that look like. And so we really wanted to hone in to see what other states were doing. One thing that captured our attention was what Alabama, Maine, Minnesota, Missouri, and North Carolina are doing with a count-sensitive model. And so this next slide will show you what we ran. We ran several different alternatives as we did with poverty. We came down to alternative 15 and alternative 16. And again, you have those tier thresholds. Aaron did a nice job of explaining that. And when we look at the weights, alternative 15, the weights are 25% and 35%. Alternative 16 is 25% and 45%. So taking all of this into consideration, when we examine these two potential models, which shows a two-tiered model with the removal of the district maximum, the 3-year average, the non-qualified LEP allowance, and the LEP correction. And so then we had Bryce and team. Tyler was I want to give him a shout out. He was a huge help in running these numbers. So if you look here, we recognize that districts have unique expenditures and needs, and when you have students who are of high poverty and LEP, you're going to have higher expenditures than districts who don't. And so the committee recognized that we want to fund those schools appropriately. And so when we ran the numbers, we incorporated the certified poverty in green. So you can see that's what was currently being spent. In light blue was alternative 15, the two-tier model, and in dark blue is the two-tier model for alternative 16. And when we ran those numbers, we saw that the tiered weights increased the LEP from 41 million in light blue to 62 million in dark blue, with aid flowing to all high concentrated districts rather than those specifically offset by the poverty allowance. One of our core tenets is to simplify TIOSA. We felt that this model did not simplify, it actually complicated and did not provide districts the appropriate funding needed. And so the committee felt that this would not be the best model. And so on this next slide, you can see what our recommendation is. After all of that work and several meetings, analyzing the data and what other states are doing, we believe our recommendation is to keep the single 25% weight for LEP allowance, but also to remove that non-qualified LEP allowance and LEP correction, and remove the 3-year average and district maximum. When it comes to poverty, the committee believes that option 8B would be the best recommendation with a hold harmless provision. Because right now we don't want to negatively impact any districts. And so the stipulation would be to continue to study the data, to gather that data each year, and for a future potential of phasing out the hold harmless provision. We have not set a date on sunsetting that, but that would be our recommendation. We will now move forward into distance education telecommunications allowance, and Bryce will explain a little bit about how that funding is captured.
The distance education and telecommunication allowance is simply recognition of the expenses that a school district records in the counts for distance education, telecommunication, and data transmission networks. So specific accounts that are recognized on the annual financial report come in. We take those amounts times 85%, and then subtract out any reimbursement that the school district gets from the Federal Universal Service Fee Fund, or E-rate, as it's sometimes called. That what's left in there is what the distance education and telecommunication allowance currently is in the TIOSA formula.
Thank you, Bryce. So the committee recognizes that technology has drastically improved since this provision was put into place in 2008. And while there are 219 school districts out of the 244 who use DETA, it has very minimal impact on schools. And this technology in distance education has become something that is basic education. And when we think of something as basic education, it really belongs in the funding with basic funding. And so removing DETA does cost $10.7 million, but basic funding would grow by $8.8 million, so it'd almost be a wash. And so the committee recommends removing this allowance since it's not something that needs to be in addition to basic funding. It would be something that could be captured within basic funding. Now we'll move on to elementary site allowance, and Bryce will explain how that is
The elementary site allowance recognizes school districts in our state, specifically rural school districts in our state that operate multiple elementary buildings. To qualify, to have a site that qualifies for the elementary site allowance, that district has to include all grades that are considered elementary grades in a qualifying site. So they're going to have their primary site, which is their largest elementary building or school in the district, and then a secondary one that also includes those same grade levels as the primary site. To qualify, that those qualifying sites have to be more than 7 miles away or in an incorporated city or village separate. So it, again, doesn't work if it's in just a large urban school district. If a qualifying site exists, the calculation is 500% times the state average general fund operating expenditure per formula student. That then is multiplied by the ratio of the students per qualified building divided by 8. We round that number up, but it's capped at the amount of grades that are considered elementary grades in that building. So that is the current calculation for the elementary site allowance.
Thank you. The committee believes that the elementary site allowance can be an important component for schools, especially if they consolidate. And so the committee's recommendation is to leave the elementary site allowance as it's currently functioning within TIOSA. Right now, we do recognize that the elementary site allowance plays a pretty insignificant role in the funding. However, we're willing to revisit that in the future. As Tyler had pointed out, with the current data that we have, it's pretty theoretical to know how it will really impact outside of basic funding. And so, again, our recommendation is to just leave it alone.
I'd like to note, we did have some discussions in there of if we ever revisit it, we would like to change the formula and simplify it. We just didn't feel like we wanted to put a ton of time into it at this moment for all the reasons that Ann said earlier.
All right, so now we'll go over to summer school allowance.
The summer school allowance, a couple of things to really note that are important in summer school allowance is, one, the summer school allowance only captures those expenditures and summer schools that are operated using state or local funds. It does not include any federally funded summer schools. So they're gonna have some numbers here in a second that show kind of what that looks like. But keep in mind that is not any federally funded or any schools that use federal funds for those purposes will not be represented in that information. What is calculated, or how we calculate summer school allowances, we're looking for schools to, we have to identify how many units a summer school district has. And to get a unit, a school district has to offer, or a student has to attend a minimum of 12 days of summer school for 3 hours a day to get one summer school student unit for that student. Additional units can be received for that kid if they are participating in remedial math, remedial reading, or a free lunch or reduced price lunch student. A school district can get additional units for that kid. In addition, if they operate their summer school for more than 6 hours a day, they get an additional unit for that too. So in theory, a school district may receive up to 5 units for one kid if they go over 6 hours. It's a remedial math, remedial reading, and a free lunch student, but that wouldn't be the case in most situations probably. Once we know how many units a school district has, we take that amount times 85% of the state average general fund operating expenditure per formula student, and then 2.5% times the summer school student units to get an amount. A school district is also required to code expenditures to summer school, and they actually get the lesser of the amount we calculate or what they've coded to summer school expenditures. And again, that would just be locally incurred expenditures from state or local funds.
Thank you, Bryce. So the committee spent a lot of time talking about summer school allowance. I think it's pretty accurate to say that the committee all believes that the summer school allowance is important, and it's important for schools to receive that funding. But we also believe there's some fault in how it is calculated. As Bryce said, you have to attend 12 days for 3 hours. If a student is worth 3 units because they're a deficit in reading, math, and they're free and reduced, and they attend 11 out of 12 days, well, the district doesn't receive funding for them. And so there are some things that we'd like to review in the future, but we found it really hard to make a recommendation because the data isn't all-encompassing. And if you look on this next slide here, this is a decade's worth of data, and you can see that dip in 23, 24, 25, when a lot of schools used ESSER's funds, which are federal dollars, to pay for summer school. So as Bryce said, if you use any kind of federal dollars, IDEA, ESSA, ESSER's, then you aren't able to apply for the summer school allowance. So when we looked at this, we just felt that we're not in a position to make a recommendation other than to keep it. We're open to reviewing the model if more data can be collected. We believe it would be valuable to have all districts report summer school data. As we know in state statute, students who have a reading deficit in elementary grades are required to attend summer school, but there's no place where we're capturing that data. Again, we had a lot of conversation because we know that summer school is good for kids and it's good for improving reading and math scores. But it's hard to make a recommendation when there's not the full data or the full picture. So next we'll move on to the transportation allowance.
The transportation allowance, we calculate 2 separate ways, and a school district gets the lesser of the 2 different ways that we calculate it. One is simply looking at the expenditures the school district has incurred, so we use the annual financial report to identify those expenditures as coded by a school district. The other method is we take the route miles as reported by the school district times the IRS reimbursement rate times 400%. Plus, we add in any lieu of transportation expenditures that the school district have. So a school district has the option of either paying mileage for a student or providing the transportation. So in the cases when they provide the mileage reimbursement, that would be added into the calculation done.
Again, the committee had some conversation around it. We recognize that each district has unique transportation needs. And so when we reviewed the data, 33 out of 244 districts report actual transportation costs, while 211 districts use the formula calculation. So at this time, the committee does not have any recommendation to changes to the transportation allowance. So that ends the recap and our recommendation of the work that we spent in those green boxes that Aaron went over. So now we're going to bump back over to that peach box, the basic funding, and Aaron's going to explain that a little bit more.
So, thanks. And so kind of a reminder on basic funding. It would be boiled down to say, how much does it cost to educate a kid if it did not, if additional funds weren't needed for special education and poverty and the unique transportation within each school district, and those that are need English proficient or English services or summer school. And so if you took all of those additional costs out, because we know it costs more to educate kids that have those needs, what would that be? And so basic funding allows us to boil it all back down, taking all of those out to say, if every student was the same, this is what that would cost. And so that's what basic funding is and why it does account for a huge portion of the needs side. So I'm going to let Bryce do the initial basic funding and how it operates today.
Basic funding is calculated 2 different ways depending on the size of the school district. So we start out by putting all school districts in order by the amount of students or formula students that they have from smallest to largest. We create what we call comparison groups. The comparison groups for a school district are the 10 districts that are smaller and the 10 districts that are larger than the district that we're calculating basic funding for. If the district is less than 900 formula students, we take the average of their adjusted general fund operating expenditure for those districts in the comparison group. So we throw out the highest 2 spenders and the lowest 2 spenders in those comparison groups as well. So when you throw the whole thing together, we have 10 above, 10 below, plus the district that's in comparison. So there's a total of 21 districts. Once we throw out the highest 2 spenders and lowest 2 spenders, we take that average of the remaining 17, and that becomes the basic funding for school districts that have less than 900 formula students. If it's a district that has more than 900 formula students, the same process exists as far as identifying a comparison group and throwing out the highest and the lowest spenders, but we calculate the amount, the average adjusted general fund operating expenditure per student. And once we've averaged that amount per student, we take it times the number of students in that school district, formula students in that school district, if they're over 900, and that becomes the basic funding for the districts larger than 900 students.
So as we began to look through our basic funding, we want to just outline a couple issues that have taken place with basic funding. This isn't really a new concern. There's been volatility within this portion of it for decades. And so much so in 2011, the comparison groups of the 10 above and 10 below, it used to be 5 above and 5 below. And in 2011-12, it actually was doubled from 5 to 10 on each side because the same conversations about the volatility that'll take place within basic funding. And because this is such a humongous portion of the needs side of the formula, that volatility is, it harms everybody. It harms school districts when they're trying to budget what that can look like from year to year, and it harms the state trying to budget what they believe that state aid is going to cost from year to year as well. And so it was a goal of the committee to try to smooth that out, remove some of the volatility. And so this, I'm going to recognize on the front end, a little bit flies in the face of one of our priorities of trying to make the formula as simple as possible. This one, we actually had to add a couple layers to it to try to reduce that volatility, but we felt like the juice was worth the squeeze. And so it would continue to be calculated on an annual basis, and so the basic funding would stay the same, it'd be calculated, but we'd turn it into a 3-year average. And so when we looked at the district's general fund operating expenditure, what they had in basic funding in the current year, we would go back a year and then add in what the increase was year over year, the inflationary effect, and then we'd go back 2 years and add in those 2 years, and then we'd average the 3. And by averaging the 3 over the course of time, what it did is it took out the high years and the low years, and it just created some stability within the formula. And so while doing that, we've ran it for several different districts. We looked at how it played out, and it held everybody to a more standard basic funding each year. I'm going to give you an example of my current district. Our basic funding, we generally are about 3% increase in basic funding per year, which I think everybody would have assumed. 2 years ago, our basic funding actually went negative. I have no idea why. I couldn't even figure it out. But it went negative almost 1%. This last year, it went up about 7.5%. I think there were some factors that made that happen, but under the current, or what the recommended change would be, that all would have smoothed out, and it would have been easier for the state, and it would have been easier for the school district to plan on both ends. And so the big goal is just to smooth out the high and the low years and take out that volatility. With that, the 3-year basic funding average increased. It did increase about $87.8 million into the needs side of the formula, which generated about 73.4 million of additional TIOSA aid. And so it did add additional TIOSA aid in there. Applying the general fund operating expenditure growth to prior years, it just preserves the real funding value and it reduces that volatility and smooths everything out for everybody. And so if we pull all of those recommendations back together, the summary of the needs recommendations are poverty, on the poverty allowance, we would move to direct certification. We would be able to simplify what that looks like by removing the 3-year average, the district provided maximum, and the poverty correction. And so that portion of the formula, while still probably maybe the most complex portion, it's still significantly more simplified than it was prior to. On the LEP, we're recommending we remove the 3-year averaging adjustment, the district provided maximum, the correction, and the adjustments. So we're just moving to the 25% of general fund operating expenditure times the number of students that are in poverty. We are recommending that we remove the DETA allowance completely, as we no longer believe that that is an additional expense that is nuanced to schools that should be in the allowances. And so we're recommending removing that. And then on the basic funding, that we would use the 3-year average, growing the prior years by the growth rate of that district general fund operating expenditure. And so those are the summary of those needs. As far as the allowances, that we have no recommended changes, and I want to just reemphasize, it's not that every one of these we believe should not have a change. Based on current data or what we know today, we don't have a recommended change. But if additional information comes in or the formula changes in some way, we do believe that they could be or should be revisited. And so we do not have any recommended changes for the Community Achievement Plan, the Elementary Site Allowance, Focus School Program Allowance, Special Receipts, Summer School Allowance, and Transportation Allowance. And then the adjustments and corrections, we have no recommended changes to the system averaging adjustment, student growth adjustment, 2-year new school adjustment, and then we do agree that the needs stabilization should not be changed. So all in, every one of those recommendations that we made, the total TIOSA aid would be $1.242 billion, which is an increase of just under $91 million. That's about a 7.88% increase versus the certified model. Again, I want to reference back to we were trying to create a system we felt like was simplified and aligned the needs to the students. We recognize that you know, things change on the fiscal side with that impact. The key components of that is the basic funding with the 3-year average increase, about $68 million. The poverty allowance with the hold harmless in there of about $57. The LEP allowance structural change of about $21. And then the removal of the DEDO was a negative about $11 million. When we looked at this on a district-by-district basis, we had 9 districts that saw net funding reductions, anywhere from 0.04 up to about 8.29. Almost all of those were because of the DEDO allowance. It was something that was within their, that was different within their district compared to most others, but most all districts were either flat or had an increase of TIOSA aid within these recommendations. Okay, just kind of close out here before questions. That was a bulk of our work, but it wasn't all of it. That was just the needs side. We want to make sure that we got both to the needs and the resources as we were hoping. We're just not quite there yet. We do not feel like we're able to, provide any recommendations. We're doing a ton of studying. I really appreciate the curiosity of our committee. Almost every meeting we come out with a ton of additional questions, and we're really digging in. And I feel like we're going to be able to make some really good recommendations because of the work that everybody's putting in. But we are currently studying the income tax and the property tax liability by school district, both of those together, and how they relate to the state aid model. Some initial takeaways, just as an appetizer for the future. A significant portion of the state income tax is used in schools, used to fund schools, obviously as it goes through the state general fund coffers. And then all districts are receiving at least 20% of their income taxes paid in the district that would go back to state aid. And so both income taxes are being used, obviously, to help fund schools as well as property taxes. And we're really excited to share some of the data and potential recommendations at the next meeting. For us, we're going to continue analyzing those resources, and then just like prior to, it's fun to have ideas and see what it looks like, but we don't feel like anything should really come back to the committee until we've had an opportunity to model it and see, what the real impact is on schools and what that looks like for the state of Nebraska as well. And so we're going to continue to analyze, maybe come up with some potential ideas, and then we'll make sure the NDE models those before bringing them out to prime time. All right, we recognize that was a lot. The TIOSA model is a lot, and the needs side of it specifically is a ton as well, but happy to answer any questions.
Any questions or comments from members of the commission? Members of the committee that might want to add? I'm going to give a good amount of wait time to this question because I think we've got to have some discussion on it.
I serve on this committee, so I've been very well aware of what's going on. I just want to reemphasize one of our big goals, right, is I'm going to read it off the sheet. that we're going back to. Sorry. Simplify the formula, improve data accuracy, align funding with student need, and then make sure we model it before we do any recommendations. And I think we've done, it's just taken a lot of time, but I mean, we are meeting every 2 weeks for hours, and the amount of work on the backside with NDE's help has been tremendous. But I just want to talk about, like, we spent the bulk of our time on that poverty piece. Going to that direct circ, it's auditable. It's a number pulled off a screen. It's not paperwork that the schools are, I mean, we are cleaning this up and getting numbers that are out there, that are verified. Mike Foley would be proud. So I just think some of that stuff is what has needed to be done on this model and hasn't been for a very long time. And just because it takes a lot of time like this, and just like the data piece, you know, clearly when that got put in 25, 30 years ago, very important, but today, not relevant. But it's kind of like one of those things that's just stayed there because we didn't have this work done. So I am super excited. It's nerding out or whatever, but I'm super excited for what we're doing and the simplification and the less reporting from schools, because that's what we're trying to get to too, is just cleaning up things, making it easier. And I'm hoping the schools will see the residual effect of this. I hope on NDE side, it's making things easier too. But that's the goal. And then the doing audits on it to make sure that it's legit. And we don't want people questioning, oh, do they really have that kind of poverty allowance or not? And this eliminates that. So I'm really proud of what our group has done. And I hope you guys kind of have picked up on what's been done here too. So thanks.
I think just to piggyback off of what Senator Hughes said, going to direct cert, you'll see that increase in poverty and LEP, but you'll also recognize that districts who should receive funding for students who qualify there will be appropriately funded. Right now, when you don't use direct certification and we're using district-reported numbers, those numbers aren't always the most accurate, and so that will increase accuracy for accounting purposes as well.
I'm going to jump back on that just to kind of give an example. And, you know, we all speak to what we know. But on one of the schools that I have a friend that works in the elementary office. And there are a couple families there that she knows would qualify for a free and reduced lunch. They're late on their payments. They just put in, $40 at a time. And she keeps sending the paperwork home, please fill it out, please fill it out. And they won't fill it out. We're eliminating that. A school will have this much, this is your direct circ number. Those people, I'm assuming, would probably be included in that number. So we're not relying on people filling out that paperwork either. So I think this is just a better thing for families and schools and kids, so.
And I've got to apologize. I don't think we had a lot of discussion on this in our committee, and it's as much my fault as anybody else. Either I don't remember it or the question wasn't ever asked. But the 3-year averaging on basic funding increases the TIOSA requirement by $68 million. I guess I don't remember a lot of discussion as to why that is.
I'm guessing Mr. Wilson will address this one.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an averaging component in there, and so it's just a factor of when we're growing 3-year-old data. So when we came up with that averaging component, we wanted to make sure that we recognized if we have districts in our state that are growing very fast, we have districts that are not necessarily growing as fast. So we looked at a GFO, a general fund operating expenditure growth per year by district. So we're growing each district by their growth in their current district. And so there's going to be some variability with how we did that. And it came up a little bit higher, and I know 68 million is not nothing, but considering that basic funding is, I don't have the number.
1.2 billion.
Yeah, 1.2 billion. It's a pretty small percentage increase. So we were trying to hoping to keep it right around what it currently was at. And percentage-wise, it did come in fairly close to that. Just a factor of how that all plays out when we grow it over the 3-year period and then average it.
So is it mostly because of growing districts that, general fund operating expense, I would think would be growing typically every year. So if you do a 3-year average, from my perspective, seems like that should be less, but I guess if you throw in growing districts, then maybe that makes up for
And it-
what might be, what you might think would be a lowering factor.
Yeah, I don't know that I would think it necessarily would be a lowering factor. I think it should come out fairly similar, but what may be contributing to it would be the inflationary piece of this last year has kind of slowed down a bit, where we had 2 years that we're bringing forward with general fund operating expenditure growth rates there that might have higher inflation a little bit, just the timing of when we come out of COVID and that inflationary period and how that's working in with basic funding too would be my best read of why the small increase in basic funding might be there too. So, but it very well could contribute. It's just how the districts interplay, and those growing districts are definitely pushing some of that up more, but that also happens year to year in basic funding as well. So it's not an anomaly just because of the 3-year averaging piece. It's there year to year as well, but how it interplays and probably the inflationary time frame as well could be contributing to that slight increase.
Yeah, I guess we are compensating for inflation with the 3% or whatever increase each year, so that would tend to keep it flat rather than reducing it. Thank you.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out the inflationary component there too, and if you take 3% on 1.2 billion, you're coming up with 36 million, so you're probably can explain a lot of the delta with inflation.
Yeah, it's kind of an awkward, because you got to have a starting point too. And so whatever the previous years and however those factor into the 3-year average. But moving forward, it should provide that stability so you don't see wild swings like we've seen in the past. So while it may not be great, depending on your perspective on year 1, but years 2, 3, and 4, hopefully it'll create a much more stable effect for both the state and school districts.
Good questions and comments. Any other questions or comments? Tom?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Very informative, a lot of good information there. We're talking about the potential of injecting an additional $90 million into the TIOSA formula, correct? And if the revenue cap works as intended, it would force an offsetting reduction elsewhere in other forms of revenue. So it's something of a redistribution, I believe, of the revenue and where it's intended, or where it's directed to. That'd be fair to say. And I bring that up. I'm not sure it's really relevant to this conversation, but seems like it's an adjustment of dollars going one area versus a different area.
Yeah, that's like school finance in a nutshell, that every time one thing gets touched, it impacts the opposite side, especially with the number of lids and limits and caps and just laws that we have to abide by. But I think you're right. And obviously schools are bound. I think we're going to hear more about the revenue cap that we are bound by. And so as revenue comes in, and if it's from the state of Nebraska, we're still capped on total revenue. And so that would be offset on the back end, whether that's property taxes or wherever that would be. So yes, they do interplay together.
They interplay to a large degree. And to your question of relevancy, I think it's incredibly relevant to think through that. Maybe not be immediate for today, but that's a relevant point.
I wonder if we can kind of come back to that as well after your committee's presentation and talk about it for sure.
Any other questions or comments from the commission? I will echo what Mr. Breezy said. Thanks for the presentation and the information that was presented. I know you met a lot. I'm assuming there was a lot of work done in those meetings, I appreciate the time that you've put in. We will take a 10-minute break. My clock says 2:00. We will reconvene at 2:10 for the next presentation. We will resume in 30 seconds. 30 seconds.
You could continue.
We are ready to continue. No, seriously, we're ready to continue. Okay, we will continue with agenda item 7. And agenda item 7 is that John Schwartz will report on behalf of the Spending and Economic Indicators Committee. After the report, we will do just like we finished with the last report. There will be a review of the committee's findings and time for discussion. Dr. Schwartz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Maher. Good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to submit this report on behalf of our committee. Just to highlight who some of our committee members are. Dr. Turman is a part of that committee, Tom Breezy, Grant Latimer, myself, Elliot Bostar, let's see here, Shauna Kroger, and Keith Runge, and Jason Dolliver. So that makes up our group. Like the other group, we met several times between the last commission meeting and this meeting, both in person and virtually. Special thank you. There's some consistency between this presentation and the last, Dr. Maher, and that is we really appreciate your staff that's providing information. So Bryce, Tyler, really appreciate you guys answering the questions that we have that are data-based questions. Last April, when we came together, we had indicated our next 2 steps were going to be to discuss possible school spending efficiency recommendations, and second, that we were going to discuss the revenue cap. And we're going to do that today, but before we do that, one of the things that we wanted to recognize was there was a question at the April meeting. It was actually Senator Linehan who asked the question. It was about one of the charts, and we weren't able to give entirely complete analysis of that chart, and it was a good question. So our committee's first meeting following the last commission meeting was to dive back in and make sure that we made that chart make sense. And we wanted to begin kind of by re-summarizing what some of that was from last meeting, just for the purpose of clarity and transparency, and then we'll circle back into these questions. So this is the chart that popped up last time that generated the questions. And there's obviously a lot of numbers up there. And one of the things that I did for each of you as committee members is we printed off a version of this. And we're not going to dive into this sheet right now. This is purely to acknowledge this was the slide that had generated the questions. And if you recall, I'll just kind of give a brief overview of what this was intended to capture. We had looked at the 2500s, which is the big number in the general fund expense. It's all spending that takes place in the district general fund. And we looked at it over a 10-year period of time, and we figured out what those spending averages were, 1, 5, 7, and 10. We also had decided that there was no one inflationary index that fully captured what influences schools. And so for the purpose of due diligence and transparency, we use 3. We use the Consumer Price Index Midwest, which captures consumer good inflation, so the types of things that the average consumer day-to-day spends money on and how those prices change month to month, year to year. We looked at ECWAG, which is a broad wage inflationary index, so what's the cost to employ people? It looks at both private and public, and it's broad. And we thought that that was a lens worthwhile to look at, since about 80% of school spending is on people. And then we looked at SLICE, which is intended to capture the types of things that, that influence state, local, other government entity spending, the types of things they spend money on, which is people and construction and various factors like that. No one factor is probably a perfect fit, so that's where we thought all three would be of value. And ultimately, the question that was asked was about where you see the red boxes up there right now, is what is that intended to communicate? It's a really good question. And I'm going to explain what this is communicating, then we're going to answer the question the way it was assumed to be communicated, which I think was probably the more intuitive way that we could have presented the numbers. What that column is intended to capture is if school spending goes up by 1%, and whichever of the three inflationary indexes we used went up by 1%, it would be 0, okay? Because what it's trying to do in that column is indicate whether spending for that year was greater than or lesser than the rate of that inflationary index. And then at the very bottom, that was intended to capture the net of that. In the chart at the bottom, the dark blue line was intended to capture the nominal expenditure growth, and the other lines were intended to capture the inflation-adjusted spending growth. So I'm going to have some charts here that illustrate this a little bit better, but this is all a 10-year lens. When you look at CPI, school spending was a little over 1% greater than CPI, school spending was. ECWAG, it was about 0.5% greater over that band of time, and it was about 1% less through the SLICE lens, which is why those lines are relatively flat, okay? But the logical question there was, is that inflating those numbers as what spending would be if that index was applied? And it's not, it was just the inflation-adjusted number. So the question that you had asked, though, Senator Lanahan, was a good one. So we recreated the chart, and we added in the columns. So you'll notice that we made the inflation-adjusted changes where you see the green boxes on that spreadsheet right there. And that's basically where we take the same base starting number of that $3.439 billion, and then we show how that scales up with that inflationary indice. Don't worry, you're not going to have to do the math in your head, because we're going to unpack each chunk of this piece by piece just to make sure that we adequately answer that question. So this is the school portion of that chart on the far left. The base year, or what is the denominator in all of these calculations, is that $3.439 billion number. That's the denominator for every single one of these calculations. You can see that it grows to $5.1 billion during the 10 years that are the audited financials of the 2500s. The 1-year average is 2.88, and then you see the 5, 7, and 10-year average. Probably worth noting that the numerator in all of those calculations includes the influence of ESSERs, ESSER dollars, the federal ESSER funds. And so one of the things that we had summarized last time was the influence that ESSER had had on school spending overall, which is why you see some of those inflated numbers, especially in the 5-year band of time that is illustrated there. If you look at CPI Midwest, again in the green box is the same denominator. And over on the far right, you see when you take that denominator and you inflate it by CPI, it grows to $4.5 billion. ECWAG, it grows to 4.8. And SLICE, it grows to 5.6. Okay? So, Senator Lanahan, that answers the question the way that you asked it. And it was a good question and probably a more intuitive way to look at the data. And maybe to simplify it in a visual sense, is if we think about the two extremes of these data as a range. On the far left of the range, you have CPI, and on the far right of the range, you have SLICE. The actual spending amount was about the 55th percentile of that range. We thought that that was kind of an objective way to show where that was at during the 10-year window. This is visually how it looks when it's not inflation adjusted. So those that like visuals, this captures that visual. And then finally, for those that like a percent, again, the 55th percentile of the 10-year range, it shows that school spending is kind of right in the middle of that range of CPI and SLICE. Yeah, Senator Hughes.
Okay. I just kind of made a comment to Dr. Plaus. If the ESSER number, the money that was given during COVID, which is very clear by the, higher percents of that general fund, if we wouldn't have had that as a state, I bet the average, we'd be less than CPI Midwest.
Sure,
On
yep.
average, easily. So then the schools would be under all three indices of inflation, really.
We didn't calculate it relative to CPI. It would be a lesser number than what it is.
Yeah.
So I would hesitate to
you
say
don't
that
wanna
definitively.
make generalizations, but
Yep.
it would be on the
Yes.
lower end.
Yep.
So.
Yep. We went the transparent route, though, of the 2500s captures everything, and let's err on the side of that. So, but thank you for that point. All right. Any questions on that before we move on? Yeah.
So, I know, SLICE, is that mostly public?
So yeah, SLICE, and again, I'm not an economist, so give me a little bit of grace here, Senator Lenahan. SLICE is intended to capture the cost pressures that are borne by state, local governments and political subdivisions. So think things like states, cities, counties, school districts. I'm sure other political subdivisions I'm not thinking of, but it's intended to capture the types of things that most influence the spending that they tend to do. Yes, yep, it is a broad wage index that's intended to capture the cost to employ. Again, not an economist, but it's a broad index, so it doesn't necessarily capture education as a subset or any other occupation as a subset, which may have a surplus of employees or may have shortage of employees. There may be other factors that influence it, but it's a broad calculation.
I think the disconnect here is if you look at school spending, because in that second box from the left, is that the increase, the last row is the increase, right?
Can you walk me through what you're looking at again, please, Senator Lenahan?
Is that?
I'm looking at SLICE right now. Which column am I looking
I'm
at?
looking at school spending, nominal general fund.
Yep, right here.
Yeah, right there. So the percentages there are the percentage that schools spending increased in that year, right?
Yes, ma'am. The percentages, the 3.87, 3.38, 4.23, those are year over year.
Okay. And then if you look at the wages, those are significantly less.
Look on the far left. You're looking at the middle column, which is the inflation-adjusted percent. So if you look at the far left, the 2.28, 2.47, 2.94, 3, 297, that does math out to be what the 1, 5, 7, and 10-year are below.
No, but is the ECI WAG, I'm sorry, I'm being very dense here. Which one is the percentage is going up?
I've never seen anybody do this, Doc. Is it okay if I travel? Luann, could you look at this way for me, please? So I don't have to walk as far?
Well, I don't know if I can see that.
Yep. So this is the index right here. And here is the percent change of the index.
Dr. Schwartz, you want to hold it like this?
Is that better?
It'd be better.
Okay. Are you worried that's going to damage the mic? Okay. Can I rephrase the question? Was Ryan worried I was going to damage the mic? Yeah.
Can
Sorry,
someone
Doc.
get a picture of this, please?
All right. What were we talking about now?
I have a suggestion, so I don't want to burn up other people's time. Could you do this chart and put a header at the top of each line?
Yeah, we
What
could
it
sure
is?
do that. I think where I was going now, sorry, my brain had to take a moment to reset. What this over here is probably where the question was derived from. And I'm going to go back to my example. If ECWAG and school spending both increased by 1%, the number you would see here would match perfectly this number. This would be 0, and that would be 0. So this is just showing the year-over-year change. And you're 100% right with the question that you'd asked last time. It's really confusing as to what this was doing. But what it was trying to show is the year-over-year change and how the inflation-adjusted spending looked, which isn't an intuitive way that you would look at it, even though it's mathematically correct, which is why we added this over here, which is when we grow the denominator by these percentages, what it becomes compounded at the end of that band of time, which then creates, I'm going to wander back over here, where the rubber meets the road number, which is this right here. So when you inflate up CPI, you inflate up SLICE, and you look at what the school nominal spending growth was, it shows you where that sits between those two ranges.
But the problem, the challenge, is CPI, and I think this wage indicator, that's what people are earning. That's how much money they have. So that number can't grow fast enough to keep up with spending. And that's it's a problem. If you get inflation, which is salaries or wages, and they're only going up this much, but spending, whether it's school spending or other public spending, is going up faster, you're going to have a problem.
Yeah, they're measuring different things. So, for example, CPI measures a market basket of goods,
Right.
Which isn't inclusive of all things that cost. It's a standard basket that's measured from time to time that people purchase different quantities of and purchase sometimes things that aren't in that market basket of goods. ECWAG is a measurement of broad wages, which is the cost to employ. And then, of course, SLICE measures things that CPI doesn't measure, like the cost to replace a roof, for example, or it weights more heavily things like utility costs because the cost of utilities might be greater as a proportion of a budget, or workman's comp, or other things along those lines. So the intent of our committee, Senator Linehan, wasn't to say that any one of these was the best indicator. It was to say that all three of them provide context to understand where spending lies. All three of them are also used as various indicators. So like, for example, CPI is one that's frequently discussed when it comes to broad inflation index. SLICE is the indicator that's used for city and county spending. They all have different context. And so the intent behind our committee wasn't to decide which of those indicators was most appropriate, because through a technical lens, there's arguments to be made for all three. And so the transparent decision instead was, let's present all three and try and do so in a data accurate way.
So why isn't the ECI on that chart?
Because it's, when you present a range, you try and show what the extremes are in the range. And so it's trying to show what the bookends are. So it's communicating, it's not intended to communicate all three, it's intended to show the bookends of the range.
So do you know where it would be, the line would be?
Yep.
On ECI?
It'd be 4.4841 billion. It would be just to the left of the 50th percentile, probably around the 47th percentile would be my guess.
So 4 point what billion?
4841.
4841.
Dr. Schwartz, I appreciate the range. I've never really been an advocate of using CPI to match up to school spending growth, knowing that, like in Lincoln Public Schools, 90% of our budget is staff, so you would expect our budget to grow based on a wage indicator versus a cost of goods or a basket of goods indicator. So I appreciate the inclusion of what our wages growing at, what's in economic metrics for that, and then the slice knowing that cities and counties. So even putting the range of having the CPI on the range, I think is pretty stringent mark for schools. I think that's holding schools to a pretty high bar because what we spend our money on is people. So I appreciate and think that it's pretty thoughtful to put the bookends on the range. And as a school finance person, I would even advocate that CPI is something that we've had a lot of conversation over the decades about, and it's just not a good match for school spending. So I appreciate including some other economic metrics in the analysis.
Thank you. Any other questions? Mr. Four, I hope, or Dr. Four, I hope to not have to do this to your mic again, but thank you for the coaching should it ever happen again. All right, moving on. So back to the original two items that we said we would bring to you this meeting. Conversations are ongoing on these topics, so this is more of a progress update. What I would also say is that these are two topics that generate a lot of strong opinions. And not only strong opinions, we have really healthy subcommittee conversations, but our committee is also hearing a lot of opinions on these topics from a lot of different sources, and we're trying to bring those into the conversations as well, as what do we hear other people say about these topics. And so as we go through this, I'm going to do my best to do so just very analytically, so I can capture some of what we discussed, some of the why behind what we discussed, and know that the intent behind the sharing is to be really objective in some of the discussions we had. So the first thing is we came up with a draft of some items that would be an initial starting point of some things that might be done when it comes to school spending. And I certainly wouldn't want to speak for every member of the committee because we probably feel slightly different around the outcome. But I think generally speaking, when we looked at the school spending number, I think it was more measured than some people on the committee thought, and a little bit more than some people thought. But it was generally that 50th percentile of the range. We didn't feel like there was a lot of evidence, especially considering the ESSER component that Senator Hughes mentioned, indicating the CPI, the ECWAG, and the slice. It didn't seem like there was a narrative there that things were drastically out of control from a school spending standpoint. That being said, it's always a very healthy conversation to try and think about, well, how do we get more efficient? What are some of the drivers that would potentially, if addressed, increase efficiency, and what's an initial starting list we could look at that would generate some good reflection? The first item we came up with is really feeding off of something we've heard the governor say many times, and I believe he categorizes it as cleaning out the closets. Would that be an accurate summary, Grant? This idea that we have a lot of long-standing statutes, some of which have an impact on school operations, some of which carry with them a cost. And there was a really thoughtful suggestion by one of our subcommittee members that doing some sort of a formal audit to capture what are those statutes that presently exist and what impact do they have on school efficiency, and is it possible that some of them no longer have the benefit that they once did? That may be a place to start. And that conversation led to a dialogue about, well, if we clean out the closets today, what prohibits us from just filling it back up with new items in future sessions? And so one of the items that came up in our committee's reflection is, as a legislature, there's currently a fiscal note to capture the cost of legislation to the state government. But there isn't necessarily a component that captures what the impact would be of legislation on other political subdivisions. So some fiscal note-like provision that would provide information to our elected officials in Lincoln to understand what the impact of a piece of legislation might have on other political subdivisions prior to taking that vote on the legislation was something that our committee discussed as maybe being a really thoughtful speed bump in that process. That if we are able to effectively clean out the closets, that might help us to more thoughtfully evaluate future items that could be added. We talked about the school spending analysis that we had communicated in April. And I think we all felt really good about how deep we dug in and the information that we were able to provide for you all in April. And maybe doing something like that as a commission every 3 or 5 years would be a really healthy thing. Any one year in isolation can have aberrations, and so it's hard to tell a story based upon 1 year in isolation. But diving back in and replicating what we did and reported to you in April may be something that, as a lifestyle choice, doing every 3 years or every 5 years would be an item to discuss those trends. One of the items here that also came up is the members of our subcommittee have heard from this commission and even within our discussions, this idea that consolidation is a topic of conversation. It's a very sensitive topic. In no way, shape, or form is our subcommittee recommending consolidation. But as we were having the conversation about this really sensitive topic, we came to the realization that most of the information that we had about it was anecdotal. And it's really difficult to make good policy out of anecdotal information. And so it seemed like a measured recommendation was to acknowledge that this continues to get discussed as a topic, to make clear that we're not recommending it as a strategy, but knowing that it continues to come up as a topic, as a potential strategy to save funds, that before it becomes a serious policy proposal, it probably needs to be analyzed thoroughly to understand what kind of savings are we talking about and under what conditions might that occur, and maybe to balance it out on the other side, what is the cost to yield those savings? What's the impact on kids, on communities? And it seemed like before any serious policy consideration were given around that, some independent third party should probably dig into that and take a closer look. Dr. Turman was able to find some information that other states had done similar things. And it seemed like a responsible recommendation because it continues to come up as a topic, and we understand that it does. It also continues to come up as a topic that people are concerned about is going to be a topic to save funds. And at the end of the day, most of the information we have about it is anecdotal. And anytime we find ourselves looking at something that's a perceived solution, it's really important that we dig into it and understand to what degree it is and under what circumstances and at what cost. And so that's how we chose to address that. And then the final one, special education spending. Special education is included in the 2500s. So the spending data that we shared with you in April, that you just saw one slice of that we had presented last meeting, that includes the special education spending. So when you look at special education, one of the items that we had noticed was that was a subset of the spending that we communicated that had seen a greater increase than what had been the case in the past. And to communicate that transparently, I'm going to bounce back and forth between some slides. So this is the same 10-year band of time, what those year-over-year increases were. And you're going to see as we get into that 2021, 21, 22, you start to see those costs increase. And we started to have conversations about, well, first of all, let's presume positive intent. Everybody wants to make sure that students with special needs receive the services that they need. Those that have concerns with the spending want that same thing. Those of us that are educators want that same thing. We should make that positive assumption about the different vantage points. But then if we really try and identify what some of those root causes are, they become things that might be things that we can work on together to address the root cause in order to reduce the spend without sacrificing the quality of services we're providing to kids. And some of the things that we had identified were things like staff shortages. I'll share some data on that here in a moment. We talked about level 3 programming or other continuum of service programming that has smaller student to staff ratios, as we've seen some of those student needs change. And then also the cost of contracted services. When you have staff shortages and there's a supply and demand dynamic, those become costs that districts lean on to provide services. And so This is Dr. Maher 23-24 teacher vacancy survey data. One may ask, why are you looking at 23-24? We're in, most recent year was 25-26. Well, if you look at that spending chart increase, schools are beginning to respond to what was a growing shortage in the late 20-teens. That became a pretty significant shortage by 23-24, which is impacting the years that come thereafter. So if you look up there, there's 209 unfilled special education positions, 76 vacant. You see speech language pathology, 15.8 vacant, 54.8 unfilled. And then, of course, you see school psychologist positions as well. Those are key areas for special education staffing, and I think every school person around this table would recognize that it's really, really hard to fill those positions. And ultimately, what started to happen as you get into the 2020s is districts started to do things like create hiring incentives. They started to contract services when you couldn't find pairs to provide one-to-one services. It became really, really challenging to find places that were able to deliver services as level 3 placements, and that created some cost increases. So ultimately, what our subcommittee identified is that this is an area where I think the state government has concerns with cost increases because it's a reimbursable expense. And school districts also have concerns with cost increases because there's still a cost borne to the taxpayer. In saying that, we should assume that everybody has the shared interest of wanting to serve kids, though. No one is suggesting that concerns with the cost increase here is intended to communicate that we don't want to effectively serve kids. It's that there are some root causes to that if addressed collaboratively, might yield some cost savings. Okay. And we can circle back and discuss that when we're done, but we're going to transition to the revenue cap. And to do that, we're going to do a little bit of a reading activity to get everybody level set on the topic. So this is really, really small print, but I did provide for all of you a printed off version of Statute 79-3402. And for any in the audience, you're able to go to the unicameral website and you can look up that statute if you'd like to take a closer look at it. Just so before I provide some explanation on the revenue cap, it might just be kind of nice to give everybody a chance to level set and read the statutory language yourself, so you can fact check my explanation. Everybody okay if I dive in? Okay. All right. So 79-3402 came from LB 243 in the 2023 legislative session. You'll notice a couple components, and this is broken out through multiple statutes. We'll try and hit on several of them. There is a base 3% cap. So everybody starts with a 3% number. And then there's opportunities for that 3% cap to be grown by student enrollment growth, by LEP, limited English proficiency, students that receive English learner services, and poverty, changes in poverty level. And so how each of those work, as a brief explanation, there are 3 ways in which enrollment growth can impact your base cap. Number 1 is if you have a 3-year average of growth that is greater than 3% and more than 150 kids each year, on average over 3 years, you receive a multiplier of 1. So your growth percentage, let's say your growth that year was 4%. If you, as a district, had more than 150 kids on average over 3 years that you were growing, and that was more than 3% during that 3 years as an average, then you would multiply that 4% by 1, and that would increase your base cap by 4% from the 3%. So 3% base cap times, or plus 4 equals a 7% base cap to accommodate that growth, okay? The second provision is if your growth is less than 150 kids, but more than 3% on average over 3 years, then your growth rate for that year is multiplied by 0.7, okay? So that 4% would be multiplied by 0.7, and that would give you what your growth is on top of the 3%. And then the last provision is if you experienced a positive growth rate, but less than 3%, that growth percent for that year would be multiplied by 0.4, okay? So those are the growth rate percentages that are included in that. The English proficiency multiplier is calculated in a completely different way. And the way that's calculated is, and when we were meeting as a committee, we actually used Columbus Lakeview as an example because Keith Runge was a board member in Lakeview, and it was a nice round number district, about 1,000 kids for the sake of simplicity. Let's say you added 25 students that receive LEP services to Columbus Lakeview. You would take 25, you would divide it by 1,000, and that would give you 0.025, 2.5%. You would then multiply that by 0.15, and then that would give you what your growth number is on top of the 4%. So in the case of Columbus Lakeview, that's 4.00375 in that example, okay? So that's how that calculates. Poverty calculates the same way, okay? So mathematically, that's what each of those are doing. What our committee then did next is we've had this cap for 2 audited school years, a school year that we just finished up, and a school year that we're just getting ready to get started. So the cap has been calculated 4 times, okay? We looked at each provision of this as a math problem. And so what we did is we looked at how many districts are receiving the first growth component, the second growth component, how many are in the category and qualified for the third growth component, and I'll need to explain how that corresponds with a later column. And then what's the average, and then what's the median, which in this case are 2 really important statistics because they tell a very different story. And then ultimately, what's the raw count of districts that did experience enrollment growth, and what's the percent? So if you look at 26-27, we had 2 districts that grew by at least 150 kids on average over the last 3 years and more than 3% over the last 3 years. I'm assuming that's Gretna and Bennington. We had 15 districts that grew less than 150 kids on average, but more than 3%. And then you have to take the 227 minus 93 or minus 17, minus 93 to get the 76, to figure out how many were receiving the 0.4 growth provision in column 3. Sorry for the way that's presented. Ultimately, the average base cap was increased in the most recent year we're starting by 0.6, but the average, or the median district, received no enrollment growth. So most districts were not receiving a component of growth from that. One of the things that we did then is we looked at LEP, and we wanted to see what impact that calculation was having on districts. And again, very similar. So what was the average amount of base cap growth that was realized from the LEP provision of the revenue cap? And then what was the median? And then ultimately, how many districts received something from that growth provision? And what is the percentage of districts that receive something from that growth provision? So the average received from that growth provision for the year that we're just entering now was 0.04. Okay, so a relatively small percentage. And the median is 0. To illustrate the impact that that had, we continued to use the Lakeview example. So if you go back to the math problem that I just did really quickly for you with the 25 additional LEP students at Lakeview of 1,000 kids, that generates the cap growth of 0.00375 in a district that has a $14 million roughly general fund operating expenditure, that generates revenue cap space of about $52,000. And so one of the things that we had talked about was, we used the 25 number in a district the size of a Lakeview because that's probably a staff member, maybe a little bit more than a staff member when we think about how services are delivered. Maybe in a large district, if it's all distributed out, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It really just depends. But that would be less than the cost of a staff member by a potential fair amount. Poverty was the same. Probably the only observation that we had on poverty that was different than LEP is that there was a lot of fluctuation around student identification. For a period of time, all students were receiving free lunches, so some districts were seeing a decline in the number of students who were free or reduced because it was no longer necessary to fill out the paperwork. And then at the same time, later on, we started to see some CEP changes. All of those things were having an impact on those numbers around 23, 24. And what you see is as that has settled out, the base cap influence is the 0.09 average and 0.00 median. When you look at it as an aggregate, the 23-24 were heavily influenced by the impact of poverty and those free lunch items. But as you go down to 26-27, the primary influence on the base cap as an average comes from the enrollment growth provision. And the median is 3.13, and the mode, or most common cap that districts have after all these provisions, is a 3. And so you can see how that manifests itself in the data. Again, this was a chart that we had talked about as we had that conversation. The CPI being the bottom end of the range, the slice being the top end of the range, the 50th percentile being the 3.89. We're at 4.06, and this is the 10-year window, or 10-year average that we were looking at. Another component, and you should have this printed off copy as well. Feel free to pull that up and take a look. Districts also have the option to override that base cap. There are 2 methods that override, 2 ways in which that override can occur. It can occur by a 60% vote of the people, or it can occur by a 70% vote of the board. The amount a district is able to receive as additional revenue cap authority is size dependent, and you can see what those size dependent amounts are in the table on the screen. And then the final item that you see up there, 793406, deals with the unused authority. So districts that don't use don't tax all the authority that they have. That is banked. Banked authority that carries forward. And that's something that we talked about in our presentation last time. So when it came to our analysis, here's some of the high-level things that we walked away with in terms of, taking a step back from this. We're entering year 4 of the revenue cap. Every piece of policy is kind of a starting point. The best thoughts that people had at the time the legislation passed, and so 3 years or 4 years later, 3 concluded years later, how does it look with the benefit of reflection? So from a student enrollment growth factor standpoint, that was one of the items that we looked at. In most situations, seemed to create revenue cap growth generated a corresponding revenue impact with the demand that it would create on the budget. So the Benningtons, Gretnas, Kearneys, other growing districts in the state, it seemed to math out pretty well. It seemed to make sense that the growth that was being generated on the cap seemed to correspond. There were some smaller districts when we looked at it where it mathed out differently. But at least in the short term, it's hard to think about how to make that perfect. The scale of size has differing impacts on districts of different sizes. So it was imperfect in some smaller settings, but it tended to math out in some of our mid to larger size districts pretty logically. We were surprised, honestly, by how little growth was being generated on the base cap from things like poverty and LEP. I think there was an assumption that the way that would math out, that it would generate more cap space than what it did. And that's not a criticism. Until you actually live it, it's hard to know how it's going to math out. But I think when we mathed it out with a few examples we looked at, it was less than we would have thought. We also acknowledge that on the poverty piece, there's sometimes some policy provisions that have an impact on that, and I think you saw that play out in those earlier days. One of the things that was pointed out on our committee is that the base cap of 3% does sit below the midpoint of that range that was shared earlier. 3% is an arbitrary number. It was a starting point. But it was something that we noticed, especially in the last couple of years as inflation through different indices ran a little bit hotter. We noted that the revenue cap does overlap with other budget-related limitations, sometimes in confusing ways. Spending authority, budget authority, levy maximums, revenue cap, they all interplay in different ways. That in some instances that can be confusing to figure out how to get them to all work together efficiently. As we discussed at the April meeting, unused tax authority has accumulated to be greater amount than anticipated. So one of the things that in that prior statute I had referenced with unused authority is one of the things that we had learned from the data that Tyler had put together was that there were districts that had overridden their cap, but were frequently not taxing the authority that they had overridden to obtain. They just needed some of it, or in some cases, none of it. And that has accumulated to be a larger amount than what would have been anticipated. And then one of the things, just to be transparent, that did come up in many of the conversations and that was brought to the subcommittee as a topic that is discussed frequently among school folks, and would just ask that it not be received negatively, it was just an analytical observation, is that the frequent conversation around hard caps puts district in a unique spot to say, what decision should I make this year so I don't back us into a corner next year in the event that becomes policy. Because that could lock a district into a really difficult situation. That's not to suggest anybody's making those decisions, only to suggest that it creates a conundrum for school board members and for superintendents to try and decide how to navigate that. There has been a fair amount of volatility around this topic in recent years. In terms of next steps, we share these as much to get feedback from the group because this is a really sensitive topic, as much as it is to kind of share what we intend to discuss next. The first is And you're going to see these all worded very similar: model and propose possible. Those are words that are replicated again and again. So some of what was discussed is, in recent years, inflation and the inflationary indices has run relatively hot. That 3% is a kind of an arbitrary number. The 3.5% isn't a recommendation. The 4% isn't a recommendation. The rolling average isn't a recommendation. It's just to capture the types of things that were getting thrown out as thoughts. Where did those numbers come from? The 3.5% came from the community college number. The 4% came from what's the 50th percentile roughly of the current range. The rolling average derived out of a conversation that sounded an awful lot similar to the prior group about how do you create stability around this if you're going to hitch it to something. So would love to get the thoughts from this group if we were to propose something different, trying to figure out what that might be. Model and propose possible alternatives for some of the cap growth factors. Model and propose possible alternatives for how districts may override the base cap to respond to unique situations. There currently is a provision, so we would discuss what that would or could look like. Model and propose possible alternatives for how unused authority may be retained, and explore possible ways to simplify the existing array of caps and lids to streamline the budgeting process. And that's kind of where we stopped because honestly, the discussion among commission members would probably be helpful for us to take back to our subcommittee and see whether it's possible for us to develop consensus on some of these topics. So that's all I have.
Dr. Schwartz, thank you. Much like the last presentation, a lot of information, great information to digest. I would say at this time, this is the opportunity for the commission to discuss the report that was shared. Also, I would submit that if you want to make any connections to this report and the previous report, now's a good time to do that as well. Questions or comments from members of the commission? Liz?
I just want to weigh in and support the committee's work on considering the labor pressures we're facing. They're very real. So the idea that the majority of our budgets relate to wages and then the market forces have been very strong these last 5 years. Lots of districts across the state are finding new ways to fill special education vacancies, even down to bus drivers, you name it. So the idea of considering some additional growth that matches up the pressures related to the wage market and labor, I think is definitely worth taking a look at, and I support fully that work that you're doing.
Thank you. Luann?
If you go back to the very first slide, I think it was the first slide. And are we going to get copies of these slides?
Yes. Yep. Which first slide, Senator Linehan?
I think the first slide you put up.
Of the whole presentation?
Not this.
Of the revenue cap?
No. Don't.
Keep
Let me
going.
just put it this way. The legislature does get a fiscal note from Nebraska Department of Education or from the city of Omaha so we don't just look at what it does cost the state. We get input on fiscal notes of what it will cost whoever we're talking about, whatever we're talking about doing. Does that make sense? Because I think one of your, yeah.
Yep, the, which one is it? The second one down?
Add a component, now, I don't know how it works for schools. Did we just get a fiscal note? We get fiscal notes? Okay, take over.
Yeah, I think, well, you have to shut yours off, I think. From what I've heard, yes, when a fiscal note is done, there are questions asked to school districts to respond what that cost is. I think the gap is that sometimes they don't get a response to put on the form. You know, like, we're gonna legislate X, Y, Z, and it goes out, hey, district, give us feedback. If nothing comes, it can't be on that fiscal note. So I think that's part of the issue, maybe.
I can speak to the school district challenges there. So often, if we are, we're not asked for fiscal notes 100% of the time. We're trying to keep track of what's what, just like senators are in the mad rush flurry of January and February. But if we are asked for a fiscal note, we don't have a fiscal office. So we are saying, okay, are we able to pull together information that's very high stakes, that's going to be printed in the paper, that we can stand on in the amount of time that we're given? The timelines are also very tight. So I will speak just candidly for Lincoln Public Schools. There's times where I'll sit down and have a staff member and say, okay, this fiscal note I can get my head around, and here's where we can get some readily available information that I can defend on the front page of the paper and I could send to the legislature. It's pretty high stakes as a school district to send that out your door. You better be able to defend it. There's times where maybe if it's harder to figure out what the legislation is saying, if it's, you just don't feel comfortable producing anything. And once again, we don't have a fiscal office staff because I'm pulling people that are running a $30 million payroll and managing $50 million worth of accounting transactions, that I'm trying to pull them off their day-to-day job to do this work. So schools don't have the advantage of having a fiscal office, so it makes it really challenging. It wouldn't be bad to look at those systems and those structures, and if there's a better way to get information from schools, I don't know what that would be.
A system
Yeah,
of
a system
some
would be better.
kind.
Yeah.
You know, we work with 9 senators in Millard that represent different parts of our district. We have great relationships with them all. They do a wonderful job. Something like what we discussed would make sure that all 49 senators had access to the same information, and not just what a Millard shared with those 9 senators, or a Seward or Centennial or Milford or East Butler shared with Senator Hughes. Something that captured that so that there was just really objective information, a way to systematize it. I've looked at many of those fiscal notes. They oftentimes, and it's not a criticism, it's just a matter of fact, they're oftentimes not fully inclusive of the impact that a piece of legislation may have. And to look at it through multiple lenses. You know, we're in the business of people, and you know, something that doesn't have a direct cost stacked on top of other things may end up having an indirect cost. When you continue to add logistical demands, one thing in isolation may not have a cost, but when combined with multiple other factors, could have a cost. And so the idea behind that suggestion is, one of the things that came from the governor's office that I think was well received by school board members and by superintendents was this idea that we're going to take a moment to look at what legislation has been put in place, and are some of those things creating inefficiencies, and or are they no longer meeting their demand, and how can we look to move past those? And I think that was really well received. There was a lot of great conversations about it. We really honored and appreciated the conversation. But as we talked as a subcommittee, we really kind of thought back to, well, is there a way to inform that work for the legislative body so that there was more information that could be had on the front end that would be helpful? So it was intended to land less as a criticism and more as a service to serve as an important piece of information in the policymaking process.
I don't know what the legislature can do except send out and ask for, I mean, I understand it's hard, and I get a lot of fiscal notes that I don't think are right from the fiscal office, or I used to. So I understand it's really hard, but I don't know what else the legislature can do except send it out to the schools and ask. Unless the schools can somehow, through your school board association or one of your groups, somebody gets that job.
Yeah, I would say if there is a system the legislature had an interest in pursuing in collaboration with school people, I don't want to speak for all school people because I'm just one of, 200 and some superintendents in Nebraska, but I think school people would be interested in systematizing that. But I think the key piece is, what does the system look like that serves both parties? And I think that's ultimately why we put it up here, because it would generate a really great dialogue like the one we're having.
Both parties being superintendents and legislature.
Yes. Thank you for that clarification, Doc.
go back to the special, I'm sorry. Can you go back to the special ed slide, the one with the cost over the
Yeah.
years?
Yep.
Okay, then go to the one, I'm sorry, go to the one with the staff shortages. So what did you do when you didn't have staff? I mean, the law is they have to have the services, right? That's the law. So what do you do when you don't have staff?
Yeah, the problem solving is varied and diverse, and so I'll share a couple thoughts, and then I invite the school people to help augment that, because every situation, every setting is different. So in some cases, caseloads got larger, which increased the workload, which perpetuated in some cases the shortage needs. I think just being real, that's a function. In some cases, when those caseloads went up, you ended up hiring more support staff in order to try and balance some of the needs, which carried with it a cost. In some cases, you contracted services. You contracted SLP services. You contracted school psych services. You did things that might be more costly than if you could employ your own employee. But out of necessity, it was something that was done. In some cases, districts put stipends in place, other incentive, work-based incentives to try and hire staff. So I think people problem solved. The work got harder, I think would be an honest way to articulate it. And I think this is 1 year in isolation, and all this data is available on the department's website. But if you go back, the prior 5 years, what you start to see, is the need grow. So if you look at this report from the prior year, it's a little bit less than this, but it's more than the year before. And that year is more than the year before that. And so this was a challenge that grew, and it really hit a peak, I would say. Again, school folks here disagree with me if you feel otherwise, but the challenge continued to grow. And there are some solutions that school districts adopted in the legislature. There are things that you did when you were in office, Luann. Some of the parent-to-teacher initiatives, some of those things did help. But it nonetheless continues to be a significant area of shortage. And ultimately, districts are spending more money than if we solved the root issue. If we had sufficient staffing, we would probably be able to operate more efficiently. It's a bit of inverse logic, but I think it's a reality to it. And I would invite other school folks to share, because that's just one voice.
I'll jump in there for a second. One of the things that we're seeing at the department, number one, we saw a positive sign this last year for the first time. And I just gave a speech in Kearney last week about how the trend line has changed, but we're digging out of a deep hole, as this chart shows. So we've got to stay the course. But one example of something that is really beginning to pay dividends is a partnership that the Department of Labor has with the Department of Education, and we're working with Chadron State, Midland, and UNL in the districts of Lincoln Public Schools, West Side Public Schools, and the North Platte Public Schools, in developing that para to teacher pipeline. Next year, we'll have 100+ teachers that we otherwise wouldn't have had. And there are programs like that popping up in various forms around the state. So I think we're making some inroads as a state with the partnerships from state government, from the federal government, and from NDE in working with partnerships with higher education and with school districts. So I think we're getting our arms around that problem. We don't have it solved by any means, but I think the trend line's getting a little bit better, and I think hopefully that it will continue to get better. One of the interesting phenomena from that is, as we develop more para to teachers, and most of those teachers are in special education, is some of those school districts that are understaffed in special education are now becoming more fully staffed. And so it's driving up special education costs. So there are a lot of layers to look at that problem.
Well said, Doc. Thank you. Anyone else have anything to add to that?
Other questions or comments?
Yeah, I had a question. You guys talked and did a great job outlining how the revenue cap is the growth calculation, but can you just talk a little bit about how it is calculated from year to year, what all inputs go into that? I think it'd be good for everybody to understand which revenues are included and then how they interplay with each other. I have an alternative motive, obviously. I want to answer Tom's question from earlier.
Yeah, just give me 1 second, Dr. Plaus. I know I have this here somewhere. Okay, so am I interpreting your question correct? We talked about how the 3% can grow, but how do we get to the 3% in the first place? Okay. You guys are going to fact check me over there, right? Bryce and Tyler? Okay. So the 3% is calculated with 4 major components each year, okay? The first is property tax requests from the current budget year. So that would be the budget year that you're in for the calculation of the next year. So for example, in 26-27 for the revenue cap, you would look at 25-26's LC2 data, which would have been last school year. You're going to look at the non-property tax revenue reported in the previous year's annual financial report, which would be the 23-24 or FYE 24 school year. So I guess that's 2 years old at the time, 3 years old when it is in place. You're going to look at the 24-25 special education reimbursement as reported on final financials. So for the 26-27 year, that would be June of 25. So that's 2-year-old data. And then for the last component is 25-26 TIOSA paid, including prior year corrections. So it's pulling data from different years, not nefariously, but because you're trying to look for solid data that's documented revenue sources. And I think the second half of your question is how is that germane to the question that Tom asked earlier? Am I inferring that correctly?
That was my alternative.
I figured I was
motive.
reading between the lines there, Dr.
So
Claus.
if I may ask this, so if the recommendations from Committee A were applied, how would that impact the revenue cap for different schools?
Bryce, would I be accurate that that would have a 1-year lag on the revenue cap? Yes. Yeah. So that would have a 1-year lag on the revenue cap, which also occurred when the special education reimbursement changed. I know one of the things that was a point of discussion was why were so many districts in year 1 of the revenue cap overriding the revenue cap? It was because that new influx of revenue would hit the cap the following year, and it would actually take 3%, and in most districts make it a negative number because it would hit the cap the year after you receive the revenue. And so I think it would function in a very similar way. So from a policy-making standpoint is anytime there would be a change to a revenue source for a district, you would probably want to make sure that you accounted for how that source may impact the cap so that you can calculate an assumption in for that on the front end. So it didn't, A, not get baked in, which I think was the premise of your question, Senator Breezy, or B, not create a whipsaw effect the following year. Is that a fair analysis? Bryce, I'm going to look at you for the fact check. Okay.
It went into effect for state 27-28 TIOSA calculation. It would impact the 27-28.
Correct. Yes.
And just to clarify, in that circumstance, your 3% might not really play out to be 3%. I think also one thing we need to keep in mind is a lot of times, not a lot of times, a portion of the time in the property tax cap, we are growing 2-year-old numbers by 3%. So that is something
Correct.
also, as we're thinking about this idea as to whether 3% is the right number, cost of wages seem to be higher than that currently. We also are now understand the data set better and what the data source is, because there's times that the lags really do have unintended consequences.
Did I answer your question, Dr. Plaza?
Yeah, but it is fair to say that under the recommendations of our committee, let's pretend like the basic funding, everything went up. The back end result down the line, once it all plays out, would be that the property tax request would reduce.
Correct. Yep. Yep. That would probably be something that with the benefit of the process that we now have here, might be something that could be a parallel recommendation to any of those changes so that the two can be accounted for at the same time, so that the desired effect was achieved without creating an unintended consequence.
Further questions or comments?
I could make.
Yes, Senator Murman.
I appreciate your work that you did and everything that has to do with school finance. When we created this commission, the legislature, I should say, part of our ideas for creating the commission was to address the property tax problem in the state. And looking at the three measures of inflation that you started out with, CPI, EC, IWAG, and SLICE, I just want to say that all of those measures of inflation also affect the taxpayer, and especially the property taxpayer, because as a small businessman, farmer, and it's typical, different businesses, these measures of inflation affect those different businesses in different ways. For instance, some businesses would rely more on wages if they employed a lot of people. And then SLICE, probably typically I can use farming as an example because that's my background. But that measure, building things, gravel, roofs, all those kinds of things are measured, and that's the typical property taxpayer in greater Nebraska, or farmer. That's a big expense for them. Some farmers also, employ quite a few too, so wages is a big factor on their ability to pay. But I think it all goes back to property taxes are not a good measure of an individual's ability to pay relative to sales tax or income tax. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you. Thanks for your work.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Murman. There wasn't a question there, so I'm
No, I
not
was just
responding.
commenting.
Okay.
Questions
Yep.
or comments, so.
Yep.
Any further questions or comments?
But you are welcome to answer if you have an answer for it.
Provide a solution if there's one there. Yes, Senator Breezy, Tom Breezy.
You bet. Thank you. I have a comment. As I look through the statute, Section 2, Part 1, we are tasked with several items. Skip the first one, go to the second one. We're tasked with reviewing various aspects of school needs, school resources, analyzing how things work, reviewing and analyzing, it refers to. The only category that we are tasked really with making recommendations relative to this are recommendations for changes to the formula to prevent the increase in property taxes. And so to me, that is the main function of this commission. Clearly, we have to review and analyze these other items as well. But again, make our observations, describe what we find. But we are tasked with making recommendations for changes to prevent the increase in property taxes. Two ways you're going to do that. A, you're going to inject more state dollars into education, ensure it reduces property taxes. B, spend less money on education. So we need to be searching for those items, and I inject this comment here because we're talking about the LB 243 revenue cap, And it's probably fairly critical that we make recommendations relative to that cap that will help ensure that state dollars that legislature might choose to put into education actually reduce property taxes. So we've got a lot of work to do to figure out how we're going to manage this, what we're going to recommend. Because again, we're tasked with making that recommendation, how to prevent the increase in property taxes. And thank you for the presentation. You did a great job there, Mr. Vice Chair. You
Thanks, Senator
did a
Breezy.
nice job. You bet.
And I think that's a great segue, and there's still time for question or comments if you have them, but I've been trying to figure out how do I bring this together, and I think a way to bring the conversation that we've had together today is to remind everybody to review what our goals are, and our goals are set out for us. We don't have to invent those or have a strategic plan. Our goals are set out for us in statute. So one of the things that we will be doing between now and our next meeting, which is scheduled for October 5th, is continuing the work in committee. And so I would ask the committee chairs to really reset the committee as you get back together and review what our charge is set out in statute. So we don't begin to creep away from what our charge is. I think the information that is presented to us today is excellent information and information that can really help drive that conversation. Keep in mind with the information that Mr. Breezy just gave us there. In addition to the meeting on October 5th, you should have all received an email from Brian Lisey asking about potential meeting opportunities between October 5th and November 1st. Does everybody know what I'm talking about? Okay. I just want to go through the why on that a little bit. And the why on that is we have a report due on November 1st. And if we have a meeting similar to this one on October 5th, we're still going to have to synthesize that information, put it together in a report, have some agreement, some substantial agreement on what that report should say, and then we will meet the November 1st deadline. So that meeting between October 5th and November 1st is to make sure that we can get that information and put together in a meaningful manner. Hopefully, we won't have to have that meeting. Hopefully, on October 5th, we can have more reports, finish up the written portion of our duties, and be on our merry way. My guess is we're going to need a meeting between October 5th and November 1st. And I think this report should be really, really well done and largely authored by Senator Merman. Okay, just kidding. As you, touche. So if you're wondering at all as to why the need for that extra meeting, there may not be a need, but I think there will be. So that'll really be why we meet between October 5th and November 1st. In the meantime, committee chairs, keep working. Let's come up with some solid recommendations. I believe that October 5th meeting will be a really important meeting in terms of what recommendations are we going to put into the report for the legislature to consider in 2027. Okay, with that, I'll move. Are there any other closing comments from the presentations? Seeing no need for further conversation there, I'll move to agenda item 9. We'll now move to our public comment period. The public comment period is allotted 15 minutes with no more than 3 minutes per speaker during the period. Individuals are required to include on the sign-in card their name, city, and state. Any person who refuses to identify themselves will be prohibited from addressing the commission. If at any time persons appearing before the commission exceed the time limitations set forth in the commission operating policies or become abusive or threatening in language or behavior, it shall be the responsibility of the chair to refuse permission to continue to address the commission. We have one person who has put in their name to address the commission. That person is Dave Welsh. Dave, if you're ready. Thank you for being here.
Sure. Yes, thank you for this time to address this commission. Yeah, thank you for your work. I mean, I missed the April meeting, so I went back and I read all your presentations and slides, a lot of great information in there. Really appreciate the information that's shared today and look forward to seeing that posted online so I can dig into it a little bit more. Yeah, the needs and resources, have some really good recommendations or heading towards some good recommendations, it looks like, and I appreciate the work that you've done on that. I've got to address a little bit of a hot topic with the averaging adjustment. It seems like you just kind of floated right over that one. I can understand why it is a political hot button, but currently after the basic funding is calculated, then there's a second averaging that takes place with the schools 900 and larger. And it just doesn't seem to be appropriate to average students with 40 to 50,000 students against schools that have only 900 to 1,000. Plus schools that are under 900 get averaged against their 20 other schools, their peers. We really should do the same thing with the averaging adjustment. I would suggest that you take a look at the averaging adjustment being applied just to the 20 largest schools. So I would request that of the committee that you do that. Well, it's great to look at the needs side of the formula. It really only impacts 44 school districts. So as you start looking at the resources side, I'd really encourage you to try to figure out a way that we can get most schools equalized. That's the only way they can participate in the funding that comes from the needs side of the formula. And we used to have well over 200 schools that were equalized, but that's been almost 20 years ago now. We need to get back to that. There are ways to get every school equalized. We had a bill introduced this last session, LB 1038, which would have done that. Would have repurposed the $1.2 billion in property tax credits. And my focus here is what's fair and what's equitable. The way we've kind of hodgepodged the last few years together in TIOSA funding, it's not fair, it's not equitable. We still have general fund levies from 30 cents to $1.05. You throw in the property tax credits, and Sarah puts together the effective tax rate, you still have levies between 19 cents and 75 or so. I mean, we're still 350 to 375% difference between those two. I think we can do a better job and become more fair and equitable for all Nebraskans. And so that's what I would encourage you to do. As I end all my testimony at the Capitol, I'll say thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions, but I don't think you do that here, but I'll offer that up anyway.
You'll stick around for any questions if anybody has any.
Sure, I'll take informal questions, sure.
Dave, thanks so much for your time.
Sure, thanks.
By the way, all of the information is posted online already for anybody listening or for anybody who is interested in finding the information. It is already posted. Okay. Thank you to those who attended in person and who tuned in to the broadcast. The August 4th, 2026 School Financing Review Commission meeting is adjourned.